Veterans have been on the front lines of the U.S. peace movement for quite a long time, at least as far back as Vietnam, and certainly to some extent before then. But Vietnam really came a large veterans peace movement. Veterans returning from Vietnam were very angry when they realized that they had been lied to and manipulated into fighting an illegal and an unjust war. And they also were angry that the government was not taking care of their physical wounds and their psychological wounds from that war. Vietnam Veterans Against the War was a very powerful organization, and in the final years of the Vietnam anti-war movement, they were in the front lines of every peace march, and they famously had protested outside the White House and threw their medals over the fence into the White House. Actually, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, that organization still exists, and some of their members are also dual members with Veterans for Peace. And of course, in the recent years, the young veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been on very much the cutting edge of the peace movement in the United States. And they are also joining Veterans for Peace, but they have their own organization, Iraq Veterans Against the War, which Veterans for Peace helped to get off the ground. We realized it was important for the young veterans of those wars to have their own voice. And we're happy that increasingly they are also getting involved with and joining Veterans for Peace. And of course, most of our members have began their speaking out publicly against the war after their military service was over, but quite a few of them also had resisted the war in one way or another while they were in the military. And actually, since the beginning of since the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and subsequent invasion and occupation of Iraq, well over 10,000 U.S. soldiers have deserted from the Army and from the Marines. And they're not all at large. You know, many of them have returned to service or gone to jail or been captured. But thousands are still AWOL. AWOL is a term you may be familiar with, away without official leave. They took off. Some of them are, actually most of them are what we call underground in the U.S. Some of them are living surprisingly openly with the knowledge of their family and friends. Some of them are living almost normal lives, but they have this possibility of being arrested at any time and going to prison. So they need and deserve our support. Several hundred have also fled to Canada. Most of them are Iraq veterans. They've served one tour of Iraq. They saw the reality, the nightmare of that war, and when they were ordered to go back, they refused and instead fled the country. They're seeking sanctuary in Canada. They've had a very difficult time. They're getting no support from the Canadian government. They've been forced to apply for political refugee status. None of them have been granted that status yet. Some of them are appealing, and there's been 3 or 4 of them deported back to the U.S. who've gone to jail for a year and more. And there's a young, Helen and I just met, we've been traveling around Europe, we met Andre Shepard in Germany, who's an Iraq veteran who's applied for political asylum there. So these resistors really do need our support, and I'm really happy that UK Veterans for Peace, even before its founding meeting today, has already been actively supporting soldiers who here in the UK who've resisted the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and including Bradley Manning. Now, Bradley Manning, most of you have you all heard of Bradley Manning? Who has not heard of Bradley Manning? Okay, it was probably a couple people. I don't want to put you on the spot there. But at any rate, Bradley Manning has become kind of the preeminent soldier resistor of our time. And, you know, resistance takes many, many forms. I mean, I've talked to guys in Iraq veterans who would go out on missions in their armored vehicle, sometimes tank, and basically go park under the underpass somewhere and just avoid contact with the enemy. Sometimes they'd even send notes with the Iraqi kids. You know, take this over to your big brother, tell him we don't want any contact with you, we're not going to mess with you, hope you won't mess with us. And yeah, that was very common in Vietnam too. They called it search and avoid missions. These guys in Iraq actually went a step further. Some of them are pretty tech savvy, because back at the home base, they had computers that could track, you know, where the tank is going, and they figured out a way to tell it that the tank was over here when they were still over here under the underpass. You know, so that's pretty impressive with that. So a lot of resistance that goes on, you'll never hear about it. Or you might hear about it many years later. If you see the movie Sir No Sir, the hidden history of GI resistance during Vietnam with military resistance within the military, it's amazing, all the different forms of resistance that took place. Very creative. Now, we met, Helen and I recently met Malalai Joya from Afghanistan, and she's a young woman who's taken a very courageous stance against the U.S. occupation and also against the Taliban and the warlords in Afghanistan. And she said, you know, a lot of the GIs in Afghanistan, they're helping to get the truth out just by sending videos and photos of what's really happening there and getting the truth out about the war. So that's another form of resistance, and of course Bradley Manning is I guess the epitome of that, because if he actually did what the U.S. Army has accused him of doing, he made public hundreds of thousands of documents. And what were these documents? Well, first of all, there's the collateral murder video, which was released by WikiLeaks, and it's been seen by millions of people on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. And what it shows is that U.S. soldiers in an Apache helicopter in Baghdad kind of casually shooting down unarmed civilians below, and clearly a war crime. And also, he released the Iraq War Diaries and the Afghan War Diaries, which are daily Army reports of, you know, what's going on the ground. And what they reveal is that the killing of civilians was much more widespread and much more routine than the military ever admitted to. And also that these killings were regularly covered up. And you can see the pattern if you follow these news stories. You know, you'll hear that a number of Afghan civilians were bombed and killed. And then, first, the Army will deny that they had anything to do with it, or they'll deny that they were civilians, these were terrorists that we killed. And then, you know, eventually, if there's media people on the ground that do enough digging and get the word out, eventually they'll admit, well, I guess we made a little mistake there, you know, we'll go pay them off and try to make good on it. So, anyway, Bradley Manning revealed that these wars, or initiating a war that is an unnecessary war, a war of choice, that is against international law, is, of course, the biggest crime of all, war crime of all. These wars and occupations are one huge war crime, but within them are many, many war crimes virtually on a daily basis. And that's what Bradley Manning has revealed. And that's why he's being persecuted the way he's being persecuted. He's been in custody now for almost 2 years. He was arrested in May of 2010, just a month after the collateral murder video was released. And only now is he finally, you know, coming to court-martial. He's had, plus, as you know, he was held in solitary confinement for much of that time, and in torturous conditions. Well, first of all, solitary confinement is torture, and it's certainly a way to destroy a person. But he was not allowed to exercise. He was not allowed to have contact with other prisoners. He was forced to stand naked at attention, and just generally abused. And many people believe that what the military was trying to do was to break him and to get him to turn on Julian Assange, because they're trying to gather evidence. There is, by the way, a secret grand jury in the United States which has apparently released a secret indictment against Julian Assange. As of, we know this as of about a month ago when it was released by WikiLeaks, of all places. But at any rate, Bradley Manning is being made a scapegoat for these illegal wars. Instead of dealing with the reality that they're waging unjust, illegal wars that are populated by war crimes, they're trying to shoot the messengers. They're trying to shoot Julian Assange and Bradley Manning. Bradley Manning finally had his first pretrial hearing right before Christmas time. I think it was no coincidence that it was done at a time where the public wouldn't be paying much attention to what was going on. Bradley's court-martial may be in August. The Army's pushing for August. That'll be like 2.5 years after he was arrested. His attorney is pushing for April, which would be this month, and raising concerns about Bradley being denied the right to a speedy trial. There's so many complex issues in this trial about like who should have access to the evidence. The government and the military are not allowing the defense to have access to evidence which would clear Bradley Manning. Much of these documents never should have been classified in the first place, and hundreds of thousands of people had access to it. There are reports that were done by the State Department and the Defense Department that show that WikiLeaks releases did little or no damage to the United States, and not a single person has been harmed as a result of it. And yet the judge in the court-martial is not allowing the defense to have access to those reports or to call witnesses who could testify to that. At any rate, we go on about Bradley Manning. I think it's really, really important. There's so many issues that come out here in terms of transparency, in terms of internet freedom, and just freedom of speech, the right of the people to know. It's not a war crime. It's not a crime to release information about war crimes. In fact, it's a crime to cover up information about war crimes, as the U.S. Army is doing. So Bradley Manning really needs and deserves our support. The crime that he's charged with, aiding the enemy, actually carries the death penalty. And although the Army prosecutors say they will not pursue the death penalty, they're not asking for the death penalty, theoretically the judge could go ahead, if he's convicted of aiding the enemy, and sentence him to death. I think what the Army certainly wants to do is put him away for the rest of his life, for a good number of his years, as an example, so nobody else ever thinks about doing the same thing. And also just to, I think it's a very vindictive prosecution, because of course they're very angry that he let people know the truth about these wars. So he very much needs and deserves our support. He's getting a lot of support. The Bradley Manning Support Network, it's a very good website. You can go to bradleymanning.org with almost daily updates and lots of information there, as well as new action initiatives you can support. We've raised, I happen to be on the steering committee representing Veterans for Peace of the Bradley Manning Support Network. We've raised over $400,000 for his legal and political defense, and almost all that money has come in small donations from people all over the world. There's a Facebook page, Free Bradley, and it's got something like 40,000 followers at this point in time. There's a lot of people really understand the importance of supporting Bradley Manning. Clearly, Ben Griffin and Kieran O'Reilly and the newly formed UK Veterans for Peace understands that, because you've been out on the streets already supporting Julian Assange and supporting Bradley Manning, and it's much appreciated. I think that this formation of the UK Veterans for Peace is a wonderful thing. It seems like it really speaks to the needs here, and talking to the veterans here, it's like very much like talking to the young vets in the U.S. Who've all experienced the same wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think really that the Veterans for Peace in the United States is going to be strengthened and inspired by the work that you are doing here. So we're very, very grateful and thankful and hopeful that we can force maybe the government to drop the charges against Bradley Manning and free him once and for all, to start building support in the United States for amnesty for all of the war resistors, and hopefully not only to end the wars and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, but to cause a real paradigm change in the consciousness of the people in both of our nations, so that we will go to war no more. Thank you.